So for those of you just coming today, welcome. This is like probably the most esoteric, difficult to understand part of the Sefer, the very end. We'll try our best. But before that, I want to thank Rabbi Braun, who started this class 8 years ago It was about 8 years ago.
It was a long time.
It was a long time. First we learned Derech Hashem, then we did Mesilas Yesharim, and now we're about to finish Daas Tevunos. So thank you to Rabbi Braun. This is all in his chus that we have this class, and thanks for bringing the bagels, especially today. And thank you to the JLC for hosting us for 8 years, and Rabbi Zisau for originally allowing to have us here, and now Rabbi Kippur. And Daas Tevunos, we've actually been spending 3 years on, 3 years, just to cover some of the things that we covered. There's a lot of information in the Sefer, so we're not going to remember it just doing it one time, but if you want to borrow this from me or you want to get it, in the back of this English Daas Tevunos, they have a great English summary of everything covered in the Sefer. And also, if you want to listen, all of the classes are online. But some of the topics that we talked about was how evil exists. I mean, how could a good God create evil? Why evil exists? What can or can't we understand about Hashem? We covered. Where's the world going? What's the plan for the world? What's the purpose of Tchias HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead? How does Mashiach work into all that? We talked about the different stages of the world. This world, or Adam before he sinned, Adam after he sinned. We talked about Olam Haba, what that is going to be like. We talked about the impact of mitzvos when a person does them on the world. We talked about how God executes justice and how He guides the world to its final conclusion, and that how Hashem is dealing with the world in these two different ways and how they interact with each other. We talked about why bad things happen to good people, and then finally we just finished talking about how prophecy works. And now, for the simplest of topics covered in Daas Tevunos, it's almost kind of funny, like he asks as an aside, how did God create the world? So that's what we're on now. But so far the answer was that we can't understand how God created the world, but what we can do is we can look back at creation and we can see the process of how God created the world. We're never going to understand how God created something from nothing. It's beyond our comprehension. Many things are beyond our comprehension. The mashal, the parable that I like to say, speak to someone who was blind for his entire life that can never see and try to explain to him the difference between red and blue. Can't do it. It's impossible. There's no way to explain it. The person has no frame of reference. Similarly, to understand certain things about Hashem, we have no frame of reference. It's just totally impossible. However, God does want us to understand certain things, and the way we understand those things is by looking at creation and working our way back to see how God interacts with the world. But when it comes to understanding God's essence, totally impossible. Totally impossible. How He created the world, impossible. But we can learn the process with which He created the world. So we said the process was that first Hashem brought about certain emanations, certain spiritual forces, and through those spiritual forces, the world was created. That's a very important thing to remember, that it's not just us in the physical world and a spiritual world, but there are many levels of spirituality, many spiritual worlds that we can't directly come in contact with in the physical world. And it's important this is important to remember in our service of Hashem, because when we do a mitzvah, when we do an avera, it affects those spiritual worlds, as discussed at length in Nefesh Chaim. But there's a whole spiritual existence that is just as real, if not more real, than the physical world. So now we're just going to finish off discussing about these different emanations and how they interact. I already mentioned to you that these hashpos, these spiritual emanations that Hashem brought about into existence, they have different levels. Because you can only call the cause of the physical world the lowest level of spiritual emanation that God created, that He brought into being. So you have spiritual hashpos, spiritual emanations, and they get lower and lower and lower. Because each one is causing the one below it. So the direct cause of our physical world is only the lowest spiritual world. I already explained this very well earlier. When Hashem brought about into being the original hashpah, the original spiritual emanation, it had the ability to make the physical world. You could say in a way that the physical world is included in that first emanation. It was only brought into being. Right? Hashem, why did He bring out into being these spiritual emanations? He didn't have to do that. He did that because that was the process with which He was creating the physical world. But the first emanation, the closest to Hashem in the spiritual world, that's the furthest from our physical world. Right? Hashem didn't need to bring out into being the highest level of spiritual emanation to create the physical world, because he could have just created or brought it into being the lowest level of spiritual emanation. But that's why he did it. How he did it. Why did he do it? I don't know. However, the second lower emanation is closer to us. It includes more and is closer to what was in the first emanation. And from the last emanation we have the physical world where we exist now. Like we just mentioned, the first emanation that Hashem created is much more elevated than it had to be to create the physical world. And the second emanation is more, I think he's saying here it's less spiritual than the first one. He says in each hashpa, each emanation, you have the potential for the emanation below it, but it's only called a tolda of coming out into reality after that. After the second, you have in the first emanation the ability, the potential for all the subsequent emanations, and it's only called being in existence when it actually comes about into existence. This is very esoteric. Please don't think the whole sefer was like this for those that joined us the entire time. The emanations and what comes out of them are one item. But the emanations are called Hashem's hashgacha. And the toldos, what came out of them, are the what actually exists from Hashem's hashgacha. Now this is something we talked about many times in the sefer, that Hashem's hashgacha, we talk about how Hashem's plan and overlooking the world, we can't we can't know the essence of that. We talk about Hashem, His essence. We talk about Hashem's knowledge. We talk about Hashem's remembering things, Hashem's compassion. He says we can't talk about that in Hashem's essence, because when we talk about a human being, we say a person's smart, he's kind, he remembers things. Those are things which are separate from the person. We could talk about a person and his memory, totally separate. When we talk about Hashem, Hashem's essence is simple. It's pashut. All of these things you cannot separate from Hashem, and therefore we have no frame of reference to talk about it. We can't. Anytime we talk about these things, we don't talk about it in relation to Hashem's essence. So we do talk about them. We talk about Hashem being merciful. We do talk about Hashem being wise. All those things. So what do we mean? These are things that we understand based on Hashem's actions. We understand that Hashem relates with the world with wisdom, with mercy, with remembering, things like that. But when we talk about Hashem's knowledge, that we can't understand. His essence, the essence of Hashem's knowledge, that we can't understand. We can only understand how He works with the world. Right. Just based on the things that Hashem brought into existence, we could understand them, but not in His essence at all. And this should be enough to what you asked me. If it's very difficult to understand these things. You know, there's a sefer called Sefer HaKlalim that the Ramchal also wrote. So if you look in the Chaim Freelander edition that Rabbi Jacoby is using, he'll write on the bottom to look in Sefer HaKlalim, which corresponds to Das Tevunos. Really what the Ramchal is doing in the sefer. He wrote a Kabbalah sefer. And if you look in the Sefer HaKlalim, he's talking about all these Kabbalistic concepts that are very difficult to understand. And what he did is he wrote Das Tevunos for the common folk. The reason we mentioned that he had to do that because he was being persecuted. He lived shortly after the time of Shabtai Tzvi, and anytime they had someone who was expressing lofty ideas, they suspected him. Oh, maybe he's a closet Sabbatean, and maybe he's a follower of the false Messiah. So he was actually run out of different cities. So what he did was he wrote certain svarim with Kabbalistic ideas, but he wrote it in a way that people can understand, because he had to, he wasn't allowed to print Kabbalistic svarim, because then he would have been persecuted even more. So he was forbidden from doing that. So what he did was he put Kabbalistic ideas and he wrote it in a way that the average folks can understand. So in a way, the hashgacha was actually very great that happened, because now we have a sefer that we can mostly understand. This, I think, it's funny that I happen to think that this ending of the sefer, when he kind of just asked like, oh, by the way, you've answered all my questions, but can you tell me how Hashem created the world? I happen to think this is one of the most difficult parts of the sefer, but okay, we tried our best. Okay, so he concludes, Amar Hanashama, the soul says, I'm very, very happy. You taught me very great and deep ideas. Now I'm left with a complete faith. Now I'm very happy that I believe, and you taught me everything that a Jewish person is required to believe. It's very important. Judaism is a religion where we're required to do actions, but we're also required to believe certain things. So he started the sefer by saying that he has trouble with certain things about how, what's the idea of Mashiach, how good people get punished, why bad people seem to be rewarded, and then he writes, Baruch Hashem l'olam amen v'amen, tam v'nishlam shevach l'kel bari olam, haisa shla maso yom chamish b'shabbos, erev shchodesh b'shnas, hey tav tzadi daled. He finished the sefer in 1734. L'yudim haisa erda v'simcha sasan v'ikar yichvod Hashem l'olam yismach Hashem v'masav yismach yisrael v'yisrael b'nei Tzion yigilu v'makom. May the Jewish people rejoice in the one who made them. May the children of Tzion delight in their king. That we finish. Thank you everyone for coming. Next week, also thank you to Rabbi Braun. We're going to be starting Shar B'Tachon of Chavos Havavos. This is while this sefer was dealing with more conceptual ideas, Shar B'Tachon also deals with conceptual ideas of B'Tachon, but it's more practical, how we can live our life trusting in God. So we're going to learn it hopefully and then put it into practice. And again, thank you to Rabbi Braun for his inspiration on that.